How can we trust our rationale to tell us these universal moral truths that we need to build our lives on?
Yo, hey kids, let's decolonize the Christian faith a little bit. This isn't the exact clip that I was looking for, but you can go find the clips. You can go to YouTube, watch the Jubilee thing. And in one of the prompts, Allie Beth Stuckley, I think is her name, is advocating for monogamous heterosexual marriage, right? A typical thing if you've grown up in Christianity, right, that you've heard for a long time. And the main argument that she is making is that when the Bible talks about this relationship, about marriage, it is telling us something that is prescriptive. This is God telling you what to do, not just simply describing what is. She also early on in the video talks about how she believes in reading the Bible in all of its context. But here's the thing that I want you to think about as we decolonize this idea. We're going to look specifically at marriages. Main scriptures that people point to is Genesis 1 and 2, right? Describing the creative order, right? A term that we made up, an idea that we made up. You're not going to see Genesis 1 and 2, and then the Bible be and this is what we call the creative order. We'll then point to Jesus's teachings in Matthew, where he is asked a question about divorce and what should Christians do in divorce. And then Jesus says, well, marriage is one man and one woman. And then the argument is then made, that is Jesus affirming this natural order. But let's think about this differently. Or not differently, with more context. One of the things that I thought growing up in church that was interesting to me, that kind of helped me start to apply the Bible in a way that had actual fruit, instead of principle or positions that you would take and stand in them and not move. It would cause me to have to be flexible, because in this context, the honorable thing to do here may be this. In this context, the honorable thing may be to do this. But the goal for the Christian is, in whatever context, to do what is just and holy and righteous and honorable. I would actually argue that she is reading back into the text her own context and her own worldview. So for example, if you were to ask me 20 years ago, before we had marriage equality here in the United States, a question about divorce, I would say, well, the husband and the wife. Why? Because at the time, that was the only thing that was fucking allowed. So similarly, if you're going to ask Jesus something about marriage, he's going to answer you about marriage. And in the context of Rome, in the occupation that early Christianity grew up in, the only legal marriage, not because it was biblical, but because of Rome, was between a man and a woman, a free man and a free woman. So then that begs the question, what if you had two enslaved people that were, for all intents and purposes, married but not legally recognized because they weren't free? Furthermore, this does not mean that there weren't other forms and expressions of relationships that were acceptable and even part of the status quo, just not giving that same legal representation. It makes sense to me that if you go to a Jewish man living in Roman occupation and you ask him, hey, Rabbi, what do you think about marriage? That he's going to answer back to you in the context. And that's the point. Just like we don't see the burning bush show up to Moses and be like, hey, Moses, all right, we got a lot of ground to cover. First of all, the universe is billions of years old. The planet that you're on, let me tell you about that. Oh, and by the way, deoxyribonucleic acid. Because Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the disciples in the New Testament had no context of knowledge or understanding to where if the God of everything that is, that has all knowledge and knows how everything works and knitted it all together perfectly, were to sit them down and be like, all right, here's some science for you. I designed it this way. I made it this way. They would have no fucking clue what he was talking about. So instead, just like anyone, you speak to the person or the people that you're talking to in their context. And we see that Paul does this. I'll give you a practical example of this that I think is easier for us to understand. And this particular action has become more socially acceptable for Christians over the past 20, 30 years. This is the idea that drinking alcohol was a sin. If Jesus were to show up in my youth group back when I was underage and not allowed to drink legally, and I would be like, Jesus, what do we think about alcohol? He would look at me in my context and say nah, bruh. But does that then mean that this is his prescription for everybody in every other context? No. And that's the bigger point with marriage. We don't see that in the Bible. We don't see God make a prescriptive proclamation, and this is how it should be for everyone, everywhere, in every context. So then, if we fast forward to today, where at least currently, we still have marriage equality for same-sex couples, and Jesus were to come into this context and we were to ask him a question about divorce, would he say, well, you know, it's one man or one woman? Or would he say, we're partnered, this is what you should do? You should consider your covenant. You should consider the promises you made to each other. You can say, well, you don't know, Sam. Right. And that's the point. The living by faith part is looking at it and making the best decision that we can make in a way that is honoring to self, to each other, and to our beliefs, and to the God that you follow. As in college, I had a buddy named Grant that we worked at a Blockbuster together. We, again, grew up in conservative Christianity where like drinking was a no-no, right? So we met in college. Grant's super fucking cool dude. And I remember we were talking about this, and he shared with me a story where he went, if I remember correctly, I may be wrong here, so don't come at me, but I think he was on a missions trip. If I remember, Vietnam. And apparently he walked into this home and there's this traditional like greeting drink, tea, beverage, and it has some alcohol content in it, right? And I remember Grant telling me, as two dumb college kids trying to figure this shit out, he was like, so what, is the Christian thing to do? Like refuse the drink, refuse the hospitality, or make connection and say, yeah. And Grant drank the drink. Now I totally understand that. And I'm like, that's no big fucking deal. But at the time I was like, yeah, I don't know. I can tell you what I think. Those are just things that I've been told were prescriptive. What I would give to you as someone who calls themselves a Christian and you're wanting to deconstruct and decolonize your faith is to think of it less about the relationship structure or what is or is not a valid form of a relationship, and think about the principles that all relationships should flow from. And I've made a list. This is what we can call a principle first, not form first, Christian sexual ethic. And this is what I think we're supposed to do. Take the Bible, take the scriptures, do the hard work, do the shadow work, right? Go to therapy, do all the fucking things, and then do your humble best with grace and humility to go, how do I do this in this moment, in this situation, in this context, in this relationship? Sometimes it may be taking the drink. Sometimes it may be refusing the drink. Sometimes it may be picking up the sword. Sometimes it may be putting yourself to the sword. Even that is still just a false dichotomy because there's always more than two options. Decolonized Christian sexual ethic number 1, non-harm and protection of the vulnerable. No coercion, no exploitation, no grooming, no power abuse, special concern for those with less social power, women, children, dependents, newcomers. I don't think any of us would argue with that. Mutual consent and agency, clear, ongoing, unmanipulated consent, freedom to say no, respect for bodily autonomy. Covenantal fidelity, truthfulness, reliability, and keeping promises, no deceit, double lives, or betrayal. Mutuality and equity, shared authority over one's bodies and resources, no ownership, dominion, or one-sided sacrifice as the norm. Economic justice and care, relationships shouldn't create abandonment or scarcity. Responsibility for dependence is non-negotiable. Division of labor. Chastity as integrity, not prudishness, but rightly ordered desire. Sex integrated with love, honesty, the good of the other, not merely satiating your appetite. Doesn't matter what you like to eat, gobble that shit up. Love whom you love. Do so not wantonly without any sort of restraint or guardrails. Otherwise, you compromise these other ethics that we're describing. Community accountability. Commitments are made and lived before others, witnessed, supported, and corrected. Secrecy breeds harm. Holiness and hospitality. Bodies and homes are places of blessing. Relationships should widen mercy, not shrink it. Now, who, progressive or conservative Christian, would argue with any of this? This is why I say the relationship doesn't matter as much as the ethic. But if I were to be asked the question in the context of specifically heterosexual marriage, I would say these exact same things. If I were asked the question in the context of queer relationships, I would say these exact same things. Do you see how this starts to create a shared understanding, a shared almost universal ethic that multiple people from multiple traditions, from multiple relationship types can get behind and affirm? And then what do we have? We have a kingdom that is expanding and ever growing in mercy, love, and justice. I would absolutely love to do that. I'm glad you took the bait. This is what I want to talk about. In my personal journey, like healing, deconstructing my own identity, rebuilding it, deconstructing my faith, I'm now in this place of decolonizing the faith that I grew up in. Because even though I do not identify with it, there are parts of it that really, really speak to me. I have a very strong pull to issues around justice, around compassion, around grace, around understanding, around fairness. And part of that is my autism. But the religion that I grew up in had those messages embedded within it, and they really resonated with me. So sometimes when people are like, what, you don't call yourself a Christian anymore, it's like, yeah, because all of the things that people say is Christian is not things that I identify with. But the further back I go, right, the further I look into it, I'm like, I actually think I'm very, very Christian, just not cultural Christian. And of course, if you grew up Christian, cultural Christian is a marker that we use to kind of like shame people. You're too much involved in the world. You're too entangled. You're just trying to appease people. And I would argue that very, 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 very early on in Christian history, everything we've had has been cultural Christianity. Let me explain. We really need to remember that Christianity was a movement that grew up in occupation. It is good news for the poor. It is good news for the marginalized. If the Christianity that you preach today is not good news for the poor and not good news for the marginalized, it's colonized as fuck. And it also seems to me that as we look at the early church as it grew up in and under the occupation of Rome, I don't think it was necessarily about creating a new religion or a new faith, but creating a new way of being in alignment with faith that supported those around us that were the most disadvantaged. So in the early church, you would see people that were like Jewish converts. They didn't just get rid of all their Jewishness. They didn't just get rid of their whole Hebrew faith. They just found another way that aligned with more other groups of people to walk forward in this like new way of existing, this new way of doing community that protected people as it subverted the expectations of the empire that it grew up in. And then, if you believe the stories as written, right, and believe that they're historical, then Jesus comes along, he ascends into heaven, but before he does, he gives his followers the Great Commission, and they go to all the other parts of the world. And what I would say to people in America, that most likely you are following the tradition, the Christianity that grows up in accordance, in alignment with Rome. And I don't mean Catholic. So in history, we know that at some point, like in the 300s, Constantine comes along and he makes Christianity legal. It was illegal at first, right? And then he kind of gives it the blessing, and he goes, not only is it legal, but it's now the preferred religion, and now I'm going to convert. And at that point, you see the early Christians conform really quickly to that empire way of being, really quickly to hey, we've been given the thumbs up by Rome. And then they start taking on structures that look like Rome. Their ecumenical councils start looking like Roman senatorial meetings, right? Their hierarchical structures, which in some regard is very practical, right? Oh shit, we got a bunch of people to take care of. We need to have some sort of system or structure or governance in place in order to make sure hungry people are being fed. But the more the empire you take on, the more the empire you start looking like, your goals, your faith, the way that you are trying to exist in becomes eroded. And at the same time, there were Christians that did not stay in Rome because they listened to that Great Commission, that went to other areas of the world, right? We know out to India, to Asia, and we know like Mark went to Africa. And if you look, the Christianity that grew up in those areas has some similarities to the Christianity that stayed in Rome, but it also has very distinct differences. And this starts to form why I said in this video that if your Christianity is not indigenous in its orientation, then it's probably not orthodox. At some point, it got blessing from the empire and started to conform and assimilate into the empire. Because we see these other forms of Christianity that people that grew up in the empire's influence, now the Western American church go, well, those are not authentic expressions of the faith, but they grew up at the same goddamn fucking time. They come from the same core group of players, the original 12 disciples, and then the followers from there that spread out into other parts of the world. And it looks to me that the goal there was not necessarily to make a bunch of converts, but to add a way of existing, a way of believing, a way of understanding faith that complemented and made your faith richer. And we see that those Christian groups were able to kind of hang on to some distinctives of the cultures around them as they came along to complement those indigenous cultures, until those very same indigenous cultures eventually came across or were then invaded and taken over by those same colonial powers. You know, broad strokes like Greece led to Rome, Rome led to Europe. It's very broad. I'm not getting into all the details. It's very broad brush right here. And eventually we get to England, and then eventually we get to the Americas as colonial power structures expand, and where they have co-opted, specifically the Christian movement from Rome, are using the leverage of that now institutionalized religion to justify their colonial expansion, right? The Spanish Inquisition, manifest destiny. And even right there, manifest destiny. Well, that's still fairly, early Christian, early American Christians, which is Romanized Christians, which is Christians who have thoroughly been assimilated and have lost their connection to any indigenous culture that they may have originally come from. So the way that I think about it now is that Orthodox Christianity is one that comes and meets the culture that it is living in and enriches it, because it creates community within oppressive systems where people in those communities can thrive and find belonging and find connection to self, to each other, and to the divine, to God. Now, I am not saying that those early Christians did not have very distinct ideas of what they thought that looked like. But I think early missionaries were less concerned about converting people to a particular type of Christianity that now is thoroughly in lockstep with empire, currently in lockstep with oppression and marginalization. It was initially, within that first 100-ish years, very, 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 very much pro-indigenous, anti-oppression, and therefore anti-empire. The Christian tradition that I grew up in, one of the ways I can thoroughly tell how empire-focused it was is because a lot of those people are giving big thumbs up to what Israel is doing to the people of Palestine, because they see that as part of this expansion effort. It's just the continuation of manifest destiny, and that is just colonialism saying that it is part of the Christian faith when it is not. Another way to say that, and then I'll share these things again, I made a video yesterday, you can go find it. I was responding to Ali Beth Stuckey. Stuckley was her name. She just did a Jubilee video, and one of the things she's like, this is God's preferred way of relationship, heterosexual, one man, one woman for life, together. No, that's empire. The empire says that. Jesus doesn't. When people are asking Jesus about that, he's responding within the context that he lives in. And the context that he lived in was the empire. But that does not give us a holistic view of what Christians ought to think, because Christians are multicultural in their essence. There is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no free, there is no slave. That's what kingdom looks like. That isn't to erase those distinctions. That isn't to colonize those differences. It's to embrace them and say all of these honor God. So in response to Ali Beth Stuckley, or whatever the name is, I'm bad with names. She was saying there is this one Christian kind of sexual relational ethic. I was like, well, what does that look like decolonized? If we take all of her empire language, what does that look like? And a decolonized Christian sexual ethic looks pretty fucking dope. No harm, protection of the vulnerable, mutual consent and agency, covenantal fidelity, mutuality and equity, economic justice and care, chastity as integrity, community accountability, holiness and hospitality. Then we can create a decolonized Christian framework in order to check ourselves, to hold ourselves accountable. And we can do all this while respecting the indigenous relationship structures of the cultures we're in. I'm curious, do you still believe in God? I and most of my friends grew up in some sort of Christian religion and have since deconstructed and left, and I'm always curious which direction people go. Thank you for asking. And welcome to everybody from the river to the sea. That same river, that same sea that the man of Galilee walked around. I digress. I do not believe in a God. So short answer, agnostic. But I make a distinction that me and a couple friends have talked about between the spiritual and the supernatural, right? So if we just looking at the Jesus stories, the loaves and fishes, that's supernatural. Something that cannot happen is made to happen, that defies everything that we know about the world around us. And not just in the like, we don't understand it, but it's like, that is not a thing that can happen. That's supernatural, above the natural. And I don't believe in any of that anymore. I'm open to the idea that it could exist. And one of the main reasons for that is I grew up in a charismatic environment where they proclaimed the supernatural, the above the normal, above natural presence of God through the Holy Spirit all of the time, right? And then the majority of that mega church that I grew up in, I can tell you, based on the rhetoric that came out of the pulpit, would have voted MAGA or did vote MAGA. So then that makes me go, well, where is the supernatural? My understanding is that the saving power of Jesus is so compelling, right? That to those with open hearts or minds or whoever he foreordains, whatever your theological view is supernaturally transformed. And so that's why in some of these videos where I talk about my deconstruction and where I'm at now, I talk about, is it for the empire or not? And too many Western, in the tradition of Rome, in the Roman Empire arm of Christianity, are just like, I'm like, where is the transformation? I don't see it. You're claiming the supernatural power or the supernatural power that has an influence over you, but you're doing all the empire things. You're doing everything that the oppressive structures around us do. So in a very practical sense, that makes me go, I don't think there's anything supernatural going here. That does not mean that there is nothing spiritual going on there. But spiritual to me is more of a place that you get to within your body system, within your brain body, within your nervous system, right? Where you feel peace, safety, belonging, and love, right? And we've hopefully lots of us have had those moments when you're together with friends and it's like, this is a night to remember. The vibe here, and not just like we had fun together, but it's like, man, we had this deep, fulfilling, and rich conversation. I'll tell you one of my mutuals, Haven, we met up in, where did we meet at? Dayton. They were in town, so he and I met up. And there's like a mall. I wasn't planning on telling this story, but like we met at a mall and they had like this little just seating area. So we sat there, we talked for a while, then we went and got food. To me, that was a spiritual experience. I was connecting with a man that I love and respect, who I followed on this app for a long time, and I always appreciate their perspective. And we were vibing and feeling good, and it's like, and like, you know, on that same wavelength, that is spiritual to me. When I was down around my family, when my grandpa died, this is honestly why I think a lot of this is bubbling up for me, because my family is still part of that tradition that I grew up in. Most of them are, not all of them, but most of them, right? So I'm like, in one end, like, where is the supernatural presence here that's supposed to transform and radically, you know, make you a light in the darkness, and all the language that we used in Christianity growing up? I don't see it. But when I am with you, because we know each other deeply, I still feel this deep sense of love and safety and connection with you, which I would describe as spiritual because I only feel that type of connection when I'm around my family. For all the good and the bad, it's this bond that we have that is different and unique from other bonds. And I've had plenty of, in that category, plenty of spiritual experiences. I've had spiritual experiences with my dog, you know? So long story long, I embrace those. I would reject what I consider the more mystical elements of it. But I'm open that I could be wrong. This would like start to create, I guess, my philosophy of religion as it stands now. If you claim to have the supernatural presence or power or favor of God, whatever form that God expresses themselves through, right? Like, so in the Bible, God the Father, right? And then Jesus, the incarnate Son, you know, and all those ideas were later additions, but you know what I mean. But practically, that supernatural power that you claim to have does not fuel you to do the tangible things of being the hands and feet, right? Of taking care of widows and orphans, of feeding the poor, of protecting the oppressed and marginalized, then I'm like, that supernatural power doesn't really mean anything. But the spiritual connections that you have in doing that work and getting to know people that do not look like you or share the same way of life as you, that right there, I get behind that shit all day long. So in this bigger journey that I'm currently on of trying to, and it's not a, like, I'm currently on it because I think my grandpa's funeral really put me on the path. But it's a thing that I've thought in the back part of my brain for a while and have just held on to. And so for me, I am less eager to deconstruct or decolonize the supernatural communities that I used to be a part of, but I'm still very eager to be a part of and participate in the spiritual communities that align with what I can only describe as a decolonized Christian ethic. If that existed, and I think that's deeper than just progressive Christianity, right? Because like sometimes people say, oh, go find a progressive church. Like, no, I want to decolonize this shit. And that means being flexible. That means looking at the whole. That means being willing to move in community and through communities, even ones that don't align with you or ones that you don't understand. It means being humble. It means doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. What does the Lord require of you? Those things. Now, if I saw more of those things in spiritual communities, then I may be more prone to believe that there is a supernatural essence or power behind it. Like I've talked about in other videos when I talk about political issues, I talk about economic reforms, or I talk about wealth redistribution, that 3 of the most major religions in the world all trace their identity back to this same source story. A source story that seems to me to elevate the things that I've talked about, those spiritual things I've talked about, community, justice, love, mercy, right? And that's where I think all of them have too much of the influence of the empire. Because if there was a true supernatural presence behind all of those, things would be radically different. Based on the latest numbers that I could see, like a quarter of the globe claims to be some sort of Christian. Then why are there still so many widows and orphans? Why aren't they getting taken care of? If that was the case and we took that seriously, I'm going to get on a fucking soapbox. I don't have one. Pretend I'm on a soapbox. Then what's happening has been happening in Gaza for the past 2 years, and obviously for like the past 75, 80 years, would have never happened. There is enough wealth among the Christian population of this current world to eradicate poverty, to give everyone health care, access to education, and to eliminate hunger. The fucking thing we were called to do. Sorry, I'm not yelling at you. Now, if all those Christians got together and pulled that shit off, then I'd be like, the only God could have done this. I guess I'll just hold my breath and wait. Grace and peace.